Understanding Money and Inflation. Part 3, What is Inflation? You are now ready for some of the more controversial ideas concerning money. By now you may have found that you agree with some ideas in these programs, and more than likely you disagree with other points because of your own ideas. Whether you agree or disagree, you should be able to tell why. Above all, as a result of viewing and discussing the ideas and facts in this program series, you should be able to evaluate intelligently the statements made by politicians concerning the economic well-being of our nation. When you hear a man or woman say that the way to prosperity is to reduce taxes, increase taxes, vote for bonds, build a battleship, dig a canal, reduce government spending, increase government spending, or make any other broad economic claim, you can smile and say, I have my own opinion about that. Now let's consider, what is inflation? Webster's New International Dictionary defines inflation as an increase in the volume of money and credit relative to available goods, resulting in a substantial and continuing rise in the general price level. Deflation is defined as a contraction in the volume of money and credit, resulting in a decline of the general price level. More money is followed by higher prices, other things remaining equal. Less money is followed by lower prices, other things remaining equal. This is known as the quantity theory of money. There is much confusion in the use of the term inflation. We use the term inflation to cover both an increase in the money supply, monetary inflation, and a rise in price inflation. An increase in the money supply is the primary cause of price increases. Price increases tell us that monetary inflation has occurred. To use the term inflation for both cause and effect is misleading and confusing. We need to distinguish between the inflation of the money supply and the resulting price increases. We inflate a tire by pumping in additional air. The increased pressure is measured by a pressure gauge, and it tells us that the tire has been inflated. We inflate a balloon by blowing in air. The swelling of the balloon tells us that the balloon is being inflated. Too much inflation will cause a tire and a balloon to burst. There are a number of minor factors that may cause the pressure in a tire to go up and down. In the economy, there are also minor factors that may cause price fluctuations. But these other factors play a minor role in both tire pressure and price changes. Driving fast on a hot day may increase the pressure in the tire, but this increase in pressure cannot be attributed to inflation. A more rapid turnover in the money supply can also cause a small price increase. But adding more air to the tire and more money to the economy are the basic reasons why tire pressure and prices increase. History shows conclusively the relationship between the quantity of money and price. Whenever the quantity of money has increased or decreased in relation to production, we find that in a relatively short time, a few years, price levels change in the same direction. When money was based on gold, a new discovery of gold caused prices to rise. In the 16th century, the great influx of gold and silver into Spain and Portugal from the Americas caused prices to rise greatly. These price increases in Europe following the discovery of America are a fascinating and dramatic demonstration of how prices rise after an inflation of the money supply. Likewise, the discovery of gold in the 19th century in South Africa, the Yukon, and Alaska caused substantial increases in prices. But today, price increases can be caused just as readily by an increase in the supply of bank credit and paper money. The Great Depression of the 1930s was largely a result of the money supply dropping from $26 billion to $19 billion during the decade of the 1920s. During this period, local governments and citizens paid off more loans than they made. thus reducing the total money supply to the point at which the economy could not function efficiently. Oddly enough, the federal government was afraid to increase the money supply sufficiently to counteract the decrease caused by citizens and local governments because it thought any such action would create inflation. Some people argue that we should return to a gold standard. One must not forget that we had a gold standard in the 1920s and the greatest depression in history in the 1930s. There are some points in favor of a gold standard, but as a solution to our economic problems, gold has been less than a roaring success. After the stock market crash of 1929, the money supply continued to fall until 1933. Citizens and local governments were afraid to borrow, and so the money supply was not maintained. Thus, the Depression fed upon itself. Economists do not agree upon the exact wording, but almost all agree that changes in the total money supply play an important role, and in the long run, the key role in determining changes in prices, income, output, and employment. On the other hand, when production and money supply grow together, there is no inflation, and price levels tend to remain constant. For example, during the period of the 1950s and 1960s, we went to the moon, built most of the interstate highway system, and fought a foreign war. The money supply increased greatly, but so did production. Production kept up with money growth, and there was very little increase in prices. During the 1970s, we returned from Vietnam, stopped expanding the interstate highway system, and slowed space explorations. We found ourselves with very few massive public works projects. Unemployment increased, production fell, the money supply increased as a result of deficit spending accelerated by tax cuts, and prices began their phenomenal rise. In other words, we created additional money without providing programs which kept people working and producing goods and services. Since the beginning of recorded history, nations have been great when their governments kept people working on massive national projects and failed when the people had little or nothing to do after providing themselves with food, clothing, and shelter. For nearly 1,000 years, Rome prospered as it kept its citizens busy building roads, amphitheaters, aqueducts, and great cities. When Rome had finished these massive projects, it sat down with nothing of national importance to do and decayed. Today, America has stopped building. We seem to have nothing worthwhile to do as a nation. The only national project we have of any consequence is arms production for defense. Arms production provides jobs, but not the kinds of jobs that produce goods that people wish to buy, or jobs that add to the long-term wealth of the nation. In fact, war materials consume wealth that would otherwise contribute to the well-being of the people as a whole. Yet, there are hundreds of public needs that require attention. After half a century of neglect, sewage systems are no longer adequate, water supplies are polluted, dams are failing, bridges are collapsing, roads are deteriorating, and thousands of school buildings are scarcely fit for habitation. In less than a century of modern farming, nearly 1/2 of the topsoil of America has been destroyed. The public needs of America are so great that we should have a giant Rebuild America project similar to the crash program to be first on the moon. When America was busy building canals, railroads, highways, exploring space, or involved in other massive public works projects which kept people employed, it prospered. When these were finished, it had depressions, recessions, and panics. Modern-day economists and politicians have not come to grips with the fact that it requires very few people now to produce all of the food, clothing, and shelter needed for our nation. 100 years ago, it took more than 90% of the people just to grow the food. Today, in contrast, less than 5% provide our food. This situation applies to almost all consumer goods, from automobiles to thumbtacks. leaving a great many people with nothing to do unless they are employed in the public services so badly needed. Individuals or profit-making businesses acting on their own cannot provide these public services. The rise in the price of any one product or service does not indicate inflation. The tripling of the price of gasoline in the 1970s was not in itself inflationary, nor the actual cause of general price increases. In a free and dynamic economy, the prices of some goods and services are always rising and falling in relation to one another. If the economy is free and dynamic, the use of a high-priced product like gasoline will diminish, and it did, as a result of a big price increase. The prices of other products may or may not decline, and the general price level will remain essentially the same. If the amount of money in circulation does not increase, the average price of all products and services will not rise. During the 1970s, the crisis about gasoline was only one factor in a much larger set of economic problems, but it became a scapegoat. Some of the problems concerning inflation and rising prices are a result of false beliefs. One such false belief contends that what is true for the individual is also true for the group. For instance, getting out of debt is a good business practice for most individuals. Debt for the individual increases costs, lowers spending power, and prevents adequate saving. But not so for the entire nation. If everyone were out of debt, there would be no way to save money for future spending, as no one would borrow one's savings and allow them to grow by earning interest. A country's real income during a year can be no more nor less than the sum of all goods and services produced during the year. We call this the gross national product, or GNP. In a free market, little or nothing is produced except in response to demand or expected demand. Demand means money, and more precisely, the spending of money for things people wish to buy. Spending is another word for the economist's term, demand. The important thing to remember is that when governments spend money without receiving a product or service in return, the wealth of the nation is not as great as it could be. If your house needs a coat of paint, you do not throw money into the street in the hope someone will pick it up and offer to paint your house, thus increasing its value. They'll pick it up all right, but they'll probably spend their windfall for a ticket to a ball game, to pay off a debt, or for a gourmet meal at a fancy restaurant. Real wealth is increased by paying for and receiving a service, not by giving money away. The money supply must grow from year to year to take care of increased production and a growing population. However, there is no reason to permanently increase the money supply if production does not increase. Only the federal government can ensure a money supply in balance with production through its power to tax and/or create additional money. Deficit spending may or may not be inflationary. Money creation is not inflationary if it is spent on jobs that increase the wealth of the nation. Money spent on highways, schools, factories, rapid rail, trips to the moon, space exploration, resource preservation, and research is not inflationary because these activities increase production and keep people employed and paying taxes. Money spent on programs which do not require the recipient to provide a service or produce a tangible item of wealth is inflationary. Such spending keeps people unemployed and unable to pay taxes. Thus, their consumption reduces the wealth of those who are working and provides very little of lasting good for those who are not working. Let's look at this complicated issue another way. When we call rising prices inflation, it is the same as saying that the thermometer is heat, the speedometer is speed, and the barometer is air pressure, which is simply not true. The thermometer measures heat, the speedometer measures speed, and the barometer measures air pressure. Rising prices, like these other examples, measure inflation, and falling prices measure deflation. Price is the thermometer that measures inflation, deflation, or a money supply in balance with the production of goods and services. Thus, an increase in the general price level is not inflation, but rather a report that something has happened to cause the average price of all products to increase. John Maynard Keynes, the famous 20th century economist, is best noted for his theories that roughly approximate controlling the temperature of a house. To paraphrase his theory in simplest terms, he said, if prices are falling, increase government spending with newly created money. If prices are stable, leave well enough alone. If prices are rising, increase taxes. In other words, if the house is cold, add fuel to the fire. If the house is comfortable, leave well enough alone. If the house is too hot, open the windows or turn on the air conditioner. The temperature in the house is reported by the thermometer. The thermostat tells the furnace or air conditioner to do what is necessary to maintain a constant temperature. Our federal government is the thermostat which controls the economy. But because it is politically sensitive to the people's lack of understanding of the public utility nature of money and the absolute necessity of its control, Congress is always reluctant to act in time to prevent booms and busts. The only way we can stop the temperature from rising in the house is to stop the heat input or turn on the air conditioner, whether the heat is from too much fire in the furnace or too much sunshine on the roof. Where there is too much sunshine, we must resort to some method of removing the heat from the house. There is nothing we can do to the thermometer that will correct the situation. If we decided to repaint the numbers on the thermometer and pretend that the new temperature readings made us feel more comfortable, we'd just be fooling ourselves. Forcing arbitrary ceiling prices on goods and services in the hope of cooling off the economy is much like the example above. We just fool ourselves by doing this because it does not deal with the real issue. This false solution often leads to disaster. After the tax cuts of 1964, 1969, 1972, 1975, and 1978, we found that the percentage of price increases tended to double within about 3 years after the previous tax cut. There was another tax cut in 1980. In an attempt to stop accelerating prices, the tax cut of 1980 was accompanied by interest rates so high that the nation was thrown into a recession by 1982. These high interest rates did stop prices from rising so rapidly because people stopped borrowing. Thus, the money supply fell, deepening the recession, and so the people experienced economic hardships of yet another kind. To stop the recession, the government increased the money supply through additional deficit spending, and so the economic seesaw started back up again. It borrowed a lot more money than it collected in taxes, thus greatly increasing the national debt. As a result, the national debt doubled from $1 trillion to $2 trillion in 6 years. We must remember that the danger of tax cuts is that they leave the heat, or money, in the economy, and we are concerned that the economic house gets too hot with price increases. Tax cuts also result in our not having enough revenue to finance the cost of government. The resulting deficit spending adds more money to the money supply without ensuring an equal increase in production, thus causing prices to rise. In a coal furnace, the fire must be built early and the fire must be reduced before the house is warm enough or it gets too hot. The same is true in our nation's economic house. Money supply does not have an immediate reaction on price, just as building a fire in the furnace does not have an immediate reaction on the heat in the house. Governments usually wait until the economic house is too hot before they turn down the money fire. Then, when they turn it down, they get falling prices and a recession. Then about the time the recession is over and things are again in balance, they turn up the money fire and overheat the economy again. It is a vicious cycle caused in part by our lack of knowledge about inflation. We must all remember that general price increases tell us that more fuel has been added to an economy in the form of money than is needed to maintain a stable price level. We must also remember that the first part of the Keynesian theory was accidentally proven because the government put people to work producing war materials for World War II. The people were not given a tax cut in hopes they would make war materials. They were given contracts to make war materials, then paid for their work. But politicians have never tried the other half of the Keynesian theory, that of turning on the air conditioner in the form of taxes to remove too much money from circulation. Those who say Keynes' theory does not work fail to realize that the second part of the Keynesian theory has not been adequately tried. And because of the almost universal hang-up about paying taxes, it probably never will be tried, because politicians don't have the courage to act on it. Politicians also don't stay sensitive to the need for balance in our economy. They are so absorbed with more immediate problems that they fail to damp down the money fire in time. When they keep feeding money into the economy until prices have stabilized, then there is too much money in circulation to maintain a stable price level. Today's multi-billion-dollar deficit spending is an inflationary time bomb. It will eventually result in price increases in direct magnitude to the amount of the deficit. No one knows just exactly when this explosion of prices will occur, because there is usually a lag of several years between the time of the expansion of the money supply and the resulting price increases. Regrettably, by the time your legislators get all excited about these price increases, which they will probably call inflation, and want to do something about the situation, they will be several years too late. Let's review. Tax cuts result in there not being enough money to operate the government. The resulting borrowing from commercial banks to cover the deficit inflates the money supply, and this increase in the money supply without an immediate increase in production causes prices to rise. Rising prices can be stopped temporarily by putting large numbers of people out of work, thus reducing their purchasing power. This was done in 1980 and 81 by making interest rates so high that people could not afford credit to buy houses, cars, medical care, and other major items. Prices did stop rising so rapidly, but the nation's workers endured terrible hardships when they lost their jobs because of the business recession brought about by the high interest rates. There's another solution. Just as a one-cylinder engine needs a flywheel before it will operate efficiently, government spending for productive jobs which add to the wealth of the nation is the flywheel of a dynamic and free economy. All through the ages, it has been necessary for governments to provide great construction and exploration jobs which increase the kinds of wealth that individuals, acting on their own, cannot provide. The Great Wall of China, the pyramids, amphitheaters, cathedrals, Roman roads, canals, railroads, subway systems, superhighways, space exploration, and other massive projects have been absolutely necessary in all vibrant economies, both past and present. No civilization has lasted very long once it stopped exploring and building. If governments must spend money anyway to help its unemployed citizens, it would be better for the nation to spend the funds to provide jobs in exploration, education, research, service industries, and construction projects that increase the wealth of the nation than to spend funds on programs which do not increase the nation's wealth. When people are out of work and desperate, a program of providing jobs makes good economic sense. Remember that the problems of inflation, deflation, recessions, unemployment, and rising or falling prices can be solved in several ways. Some ways are better than others for the nation and for the greatest number of its people. Therefore, it is very important that we, as citizens, understand enough about economics so that we can influence our leaders to act promptly and wisely to minimize our economic problems. Now that you have been presented with basic facts concerning money, several theories of economists, and the analogies and ideas of the author of this program set, you should be better able to understand the barrage of news concerning money, inflation, taxes, recessions, and other economic problems.